Colin, for making this time to talk to us today. I'd like to start by asking you to outline the purpose and the approach that you're taking with the Future Corporation project.
The Future of the Corporation project is a large programme of research that the British Academy is undertaking, and it's looking at the question as to the role of business in contemporary society, and in particular how business needs to evolve and adapt to address the political, social and environmental problems as well as the normal economic and financial ones that it faces.
So when you say adapt, what sort of adaptation? Presumably not technical, more in how they're organised and so forth.
Predominantly around the purpose of business.
Okay.
Why does business exist? What is it there to do? The starting point for that is the conventional view, what is sometimes termed the Friedman Doctrine, after Milton Friedman, who said the one and only social purpose of business is to increase profits while operating within the rules of law and social norms. Now that presumes that there is essentially only one purpose of business, and that is to make money. What we're looking at in the Future of the Corporation programme is there a broader purpose to business? Is there something that goes beyond that single focus on finance that business should be undertaking for the benefit of society?
Okay, and when you said mainly it's research, what sort of research are we talking about? Action research or experiments, or what sort of nature of research?
This is a very ambitious programme. It's one of the most ambitious programmes to have been undertaken on business. It's ambitious because the objectives and the attainment of the programme is very broad-ranging. It's basically trying to answer the question, what should business be doing, look like in 20 to 30 years' time to address those social, environmental and political problems, but also to take advantage of the remarkable technological and scientific advances that are currently occurring, and how it can use those changes to the benefit of society at large.
And so you're starting these research programmes, you're looking for people to do the research. How are you going to make sure that anyone listens to the results?
Well, let me just say a little bit about the nature of the research that we're undertaking. So what we're doing is to answer this question about what should business look like in the future. We're drawing together academics from across the whole of the humanities and the social sciences, from philosophy, history, religious studies, as well as sociology, anthropology, law, politics, and the normal subjects of economics, finance and management. And we're then asking them to address some key aspects of business. Questions such as, what is the purpose of business? How does one restore trust in business? How does one make business trustworthy? And what needs to change in terms of the ownership, governance, leadership, culture, measurement of performance, incentives in business, so that it can address the problems of the future. Now we're going to not only bring together this remarkable group of academics from across the world. There are approximately 60 or so academics involved in the programme from across the world, across all of those subjects. And we're bringing them together with business leaders from many different sectors, from different types of companies, from different parts of the world, so that the research that they are doing is firmly embedded in the issues that business regards as being central to the issues that they need to address over the coming decades. And so from the very start, the research is very focused on practical and policy outcomes. So we want to not only undertake research that's going to be influential in terms of academic thinking and business practice, but also in terms of government policy formulation around the world. And the reason we're doing this at the British Academy is the British Academy is one of the few institutions in the world that is capable of bringing off this very ambitious programme because of the remarkable convening power of the British Academy. It can bring together not only the best academics, but also the leading thinkers in business and government from around the world.
So that's great in terms of creating that sort of dialogue. You mentioned business leaders. I suppose, as you say yourself, of course, the key issue here is a lot of other people have interests in the nature of corporations and what they do, presumably unions, representatives, NGOs, environmental NGOs, consumers, citizens, and so on. What about involving them in the debate, and investors as well, of course?
So we are involving not only business and government and academics, but also some of the leading thinking groups, think tanks from different parts of society, from the consumer side, from the investor side, from the employee side, so that the different voices that are relevant to this debate are being heard in the research streams. And we've just had, last week, a remarkable set of meetings, not physical meetings, electronic meetings, bringing together the researchers from across the world with people from business and government and think tanks, so that they hear those different viewpoints as they undertake their research. Not just waiting to the end, not just advisory committees, but people actually getting into the research, understanding what the researchers are thinking about, commenting and helping to steer it.
And how much interest did you get from outside academia in this event and more generally? I mean, do you think this is a hot topic amongst these sorts of people, or it's a sort of fringe interest?
This is really riding a tide of interest and enthusiasm. There's a real sense that this is the right moment at which to address these issues and to have a programme of exactly this sort. And because there is nothing like it, people are showing real interest and enthusiasm for what we're doing. So we've had a massive swell of response from people from different parts of the world, from different types of activities, not just in academia, but also in business and government. And what is emerging is a sense that there is a central need for this type of question, this very ambitious programme, to draw together the best minds to try and answer these questions.
This could be said, this is essentially about democratising economic activity in some sense. And I wonder, obviously a key thing here is to have transparency and know who's involved and so forth, because presumably there's quite strong politics and conflicts between different interests. I mean, how much are you going to put out in terms of, more widely, in terms of the debates, who's involved, who's not involved, and so on? We
want to have a real debate on these topics. We think it's time that there are public discussions about these issues in different parts of this country, but around the world as well. Because the remarkable thing about this topic is that it's recognised that there is a problem with business in virtually every country in the world. But the way in which different countries look at business reveals different types of problems. So we have certain problems in the UK which are different from the US, which are different from continental Europe, which are different from the Far East. And so understanding the way in which people view business in different parts of the world is incredibly insightful and very important if one's really going to have an impact on the way in which business evolves.
And can you give me some examples of the differences then?
Absolutely. So, for example, in the case of Britain, one of the real concerns is the extent to which business is dominated by short-term financial interests that reflect the way in which institutional investors control business activities through stock markets. And we've had a lot of debates around issues such as the GKN takeover by Melrose, the impact that that's going to have on a well-established British firm, and whether or not this is good for business and good for the economy. In the United States, now people regard Britain and the United States as often very similar. The debates are almost the opposite from what's going on. The reaction to Brexit over here was essentially to say there's something seriously wrong with business. The response in the United States has been deregulate, reduce corporate taxes, almost exactly the opposite. If you go to continental Europe, there's much less of a focus on this question about short-term attitudes. And that's because the ownership of companies in continental Europe is completely different from that in the UK. And if you go to Korea, they've had very successful business development. The expansion of the Korean economy on the back of the Chaebol families over the last 30 or 40 years has been astronomical. But at the same time, it's creating a lot of social issues, not just the problems of corruption that we hear a lot about in Korea, but real social tensions as to whether or not there's a divergence of interest between those Chaebol family-dominated firms and society at large. In the case of China, China recognizes that it needs to reform business, to move away from the state-owned enterprise approach, but it doesn't want to move towards an Anglo-American type of capitalism. And so there's an attempt to find a different way of modernizing Chinese enterprise that doesn't simply replicate what exists elsewhere.
Because I suppose the concern is that the ability of, people to take over or do hostile takeover as a company is part of, the justification is to counter cronyism, comfortable little arrangements amongst people. And crony capitalism could be a description of other sort of systems, maybe, that don't have the sort of market forces.
Well, first of all, it's important to understand that Britain is way out at an extreme in terms of its approach to capitalism. Namely, there are fewer protections that British stock market listed firms have against hostile takeovers than virtually anywhere in the world, including the United States. In the United States, companies can have takeover defences like what are termed poison pills, or various board structures that make it much harder for companies to take them over. So when you talk about cronyism, this isn't something that's used to address problems that exist in the United States. And in relation to other countries, for example, continental Europe and the Far East, what one observes is that some of the largest and most successful companies in the world are companies listed on stock markets, but that have dominant family owners. They don't subject themselves to simply markets for corporate control. They establish governance and ownership arrangements which provide a long-term focus, and in many cases, a focus for business that is socially beneficial as well as privately beneficial.
But just because a company is long-term and controlled and not subject to hostile takeover, it doesn't mean you address that fundamental issue of inclusion and inequality, because presumably it could just mean that a certain set of people do very well over the long term. That's why I sort of come back to the point I made earlier. In terms of your process of investigating these issues, how are you going to bring that broader transparency and engagement of people outside the chattering classes who could be seen as part of the problem?
And you're absolutely right. That's a key element, a key focus of what we're doing. And I'll illustrate it in relation to a very interesting survey that the Edelman Barometer, which is a measure of trust by different parts of societies in different places in the world, have in business and other institutions. And what they did recently was to get people's views on the trust that they had in family businesses around the world. And what emerged was that, in general, people trust family businesses to uphold a broader range of interests than other types of companies. And in particular, that employees in family-owned firms felt a greater degree of trust that they were being looked after better than they would be in other types of firms, and that therefore they were willing to give more to companies. But at the same time, what emerged from this Edelman Trust survey is that people's attitudes on the philanthropic and social attitude of families was not nearly so positive. They felt that in many cases they did not reflect the interests of society. And the illustration I gave you just now about the Korean Chaewol family firms is a case in point, where they're not seen to be acting in relation to society more generally. So you can think of family businesses as a bit like families. You know, they look after people within the business, but then they look less outside of the family boundaries.
And also there's an element of paternalism there, isn't there? That's saying goes back to a sort of democratic, a system of government where the king, looks after his subjects and so forth. And so it seems to raise the question of what about the rights of employees and others to actually have a say, to speak for themselves rather than rely on people being decent and looking after them.
And that raises questions about the legal nature of companies, their regulation, and whether or not one should look to regulation as the mechanism for constraining companies and promoting activities that are in the broader interests of society. What we're suggesting in the programme is that we may have to be a little bit more innovative than simply going back to the traditional policy tools. The traditional approach is to say companies are there to make money. That's the Friedman doctrine. And the way in which we align their interests with the rest of society is by regulating them. Now that has not worked well. It's not worked well because the interests of the regulators in promoting society more generally are almost diametrically opposed to those of companies that are solely focused on creating profits. And that's why there's so many questions about the privatisation model in the UK and the emergence of this as being a central policy of the Labour Party in terms of thinking of moving back to nationalisation. It reflects a considerable disenchantment with that approach to trying to control private enterprise. What we're arguing is, one should think about ways in which one can essentially align the private purpose of business with the social and broader economic interests of a country through essentially encouraging companies to develop a purpose that reflects those broader interests. And what we're discovering is that in the process of doing that, not only do you get more socially responsible, environmentally responsible, etc. businesses, you get better performing businesses, financially performing businesses. And the reason for that is it comes back to this point about trust. Business depends on trust. It depends on relationships with different parties, with employees, with suppliers, with customers, etc. And those are relations of trust. If a company has a purpose that is seen to be aligned with those other parties, it builds up trust with them. And it creates financial benefits for companies as well as for benefits for society more generally. So what we're doing is essentially to say that there is increasing evidence that that focus on the purpose of business, beyond just financial performance, is better for business as well as for society, and that there are sound reasons why one might expect that to be the case.
People used to talk about greenwash. Could you have purpose wash, where people nominally put up purposes and create? With their resources, they can create a lot of PR about how they're brilliantly pursuing purposes, but actually, it's all a sham.
Not only can you have purpose wash, you have purpose wash all the time. Yeah. So companies make grand statements about their purposes when you know full well that at the end of the day, what is driving them are the interests of their shareholders and executives in increasing profits and financial returns for the executives. What we're basically doing is to say, how do you move beyond that? How do you really embed purpose, so that's an intrinsic element of the company, and that it can commit to the delivery on those purposes. And that's what a lot of the program is about. What are the mechanisms of committing to a purpose that goes on beyond financial returns in terms of, for example, the ownership of companies, the governance of companies, the leadership, the measurements of performance that align the company with those purposes.
So will you be looking at the fair shares model, where different stakeholders can actually have different classes of share, which give them an actual legal say in the running of a company, and you actually disaggregate the financial interest from the control interest?
That's one of the approaches that we have been looking at. So if you look at some of the most successful companies in the world, they have what is sometimes termed a dual-class share structure. So, for example, if you look at Google or LinkedIn or Facebook, they have a dual-class share structure in which the founders, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, Reid Hoffman until he sold out, Mark Zuckerberg, have controlling shareholdings in their companies. They sell shares on the stock market. Those shares are quoted on the stock market, so there are lots of outside shareholders, but the controlling shareholdings reside with particular parties. Now, it doesn't have to necessarily be the founders. It could be with employees. So, an interesting model is, can one essentially combine employee share ownership with a company being listed on the stock market? To what extent can one combine family ownership with stock market listings? And the answer to the latter is, well, by far and away, the most common form of companies listed on stock markets around the world is that they have a dominant family owner.
If you start going down the road to suggest that people, apart from the traditional sorts of models, owners and shareholders have some sort of control, some sort of legal say in running companies, like employees, I suppose, are the first in line, but others as well. Presumably, a lot of people that currently have the control are going to feel very uncomfortable about that. Do you, for instance, have investors involved in your dialogue, like people from the city, hedge funds?
Absolutely. Ensuring that what we're doing is relevant and perceived to be beneficial from the point of institutional investors is critically important. We have globally $100 trillion under management in asset management firms around the world. So that's where the money lies. And unless one can ensure that that money is perceived to be benefiting from investing in the corporate sector, it simply won't happen. So it's key that whatever we are doing is perceived to be beneficial from the point of institutional investors, as well as from the point of view of employees or communities, etc. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're posing the question, how do we ensure that we can create better benefits for pension funds, life insurance companies, etc., as well as for the other parties to the firm? And that's where the evidence is really beginning to emerge. I come back to the observation that in most countries around the world, the largest companies are not only dominated by families, they are listed on their stock markets. They are delivering high returns for their investors at the same time as they're able to take a long-term perspective. Understanding that, if you like, parallel dual system of ownership is really important in understanding what delivers broader societal benefits as well as better performing companies.
And what about impact investors? Do you see that as a sort of potential interested people in new forms to sort of provide a commitment to delivering environmental and social outcomes?
Yes. Impact investing is a very interesting development, and it's gaining increasing attention, and there's no doubt that it's playing an important role in terms of helping to promote more long-term, broader interested companies. But it's not going to solve the problem. It relies on some group of investors having a broader, more enlightened, if you like, more philanthropic view about the way in which they invest their money. They're willing to sacrifice some return for the achievement of other objectives. Now, that's a very worthwhile thing for them to be doing. But for a lot of people, the focus on financial return will remain. And unless one's able to deliver outcomes that are perceived to be beneficial for those people who regard financial returns as being the overwhelming reason for them investing, then we're not going to shift the dial appreciably.
I mean, this is a dramatic reform, isn't it? And presumably counter to a lot of people's world views and even sort of sense their what is common sense, because the Friedmanite doctrine has become so pervasive. How do you see this reform actually being able to happen? Because maybe so many people will resist it or feel it is just something that they can't live with.
The answer is, as with many things, at the end of the day, what promotes reform is what is perceived to be in the interest, the self-interest of different parties in society. So if this is really perceived to be, quote, mutually beneficial for employees, society, and for investors, it will happen.
But some people hold the power and other people hold a lot less power.
Absolutely. And so long as it's the case that those who hold the power believe that the only way of benefiting from that power is through retaining the existing model, then it's going to be difficult to make much progress. But as soon as it's perceived that that is not the case, then they begin to shift their attitude. And that is what has been happening over the last few years. The impact in this country of what occurred in 2016 has been very dramatic in terms of the attitude of business leaders and investors. And there's been a recognition that, in a sense, business has failed society and business is paying the penalty for that. There's an increasing realization that business cannot flourish if it's going to face material damage from the environment. And that is beginning to be understood as a serious risk for business.
So it may be in the UK this realisation is coming, but politically in the US we have a president that champions business, as you say, wants to deregulate, set business free. So how can change happen with that dramatic direction in the US?
We have a president who is pushing a particular policy agenda that promotes greater deregulation and reduction in taxes. But he's pushing that policy at the same time as we have Larry Fink, who leads BlackRock, Bill McNabb, the CEO of Fidelity, saying that business needs to have a greater focus on purpose, and that they are looking to business to expound what their purposes are and to demonstrate how they are delivering on those broader purposes. Now, once we get that major group of investors controlling some of the $100 trillion under management, then we will begin to have a serious impact on the way in which business behaves.
So you're feeling optimistic?
I'm feeling very excited that this is the right time to be researching this topic, and very excited that we have such a tremendous group of people, not just from academia, but from business and policy making, to assist us with the process.
Thank you very much, Colin.